question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Right now, young people are getting screwed. Year after year, successive Labor and Liberal governments have been making life harder for young people. They've managed the economy in the interests of the few instead of in the interests of everyone. And it's getting harder and harder for young people to get a job as youth unemployment is high, and it's double over the general unemployment rate. And the jobs that young people often do get are very highly insecure and often not well paid at all. Study is getting less and less affordable because university and TAFE is getting more expensive. And the dream of owning your own home is getting further and further out of reach, with Australian house prices skyrocketing and incomes stagnant. Yet the government isn't doing anything about this. In fact, if the government has its way, the problem for young people will get much, much worse. If right now young people are getting screwed, if the government gets its plans through, they will be right royally stuffed. Let's have a look at the current situation. Youth unemployment is at nearly 13%. That's more than double the general national rate. And an Anglicare report that was recently released found that only one job is advertised for every 6 low-skilled job seekers, who are often young people who haven't had the opportunity to gain much work experience. And getting a job can be even harder for people living in a regional area or for people from non-English speaking backgrounds. Young people in Melbourne have told me that if they put Mohammed in their CV and they send off their job application, they hear nothing, but when they change their name to David, the phone starts ringing. And increasingly, there are fewer entry-level jobs available for young people, making it harder for young people to get their foot in the door, to build their skills and experience, establish a career, gain independence and plan and progress their lives. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the youth unemployment rate is always higher than the general unemployment rate, and in some respects that makes sense. Young people are, as a whole, often doing other things, whereas older people tend to be more likely to look for work. And what we also know, as a general historical trend, is that every time there's an economic downturn or we strike hard times or there's a recession, that young people are the hardest hit first. And the lines of the youth unemployment rate and the general unemployment rate diverge when we reach hard times, and it becomes proportionately harder for young people to find work, and the youth unemployment rate for them skyrockets. But what we've also found historically over Australia's history is that those two lines, after a year or so, tend to converge again, and it becomes easier for young people to find work. Well, since the GFC, that hasn't happened in Australia. For young people, the line has stayed higher. Since the GFC, it has become harder, proportionately, than at any other time in history for young people to get back into work. The entry-level jobs since the GFC are disappearing. Those jobs that you might walk into straight out of school, or that you might walk into if you don't finish school, are disappearing. The jobs that this government wants young people to get just aren't being created anymore in the way that they used to, and it is a national crisis. And so what's this government's response? Well, rather than listening to expert advice on how to tackle youth unemployment or invest in new industries that might create those jobs for the future, the Liberals have taken upon themselves to be every young Australian's tough parent, serving up some tough love by telling them to pull themselves up their bootstraps and earn or learn. Their first plan was to kick young people off Newstart, which is itself so low that it's below the poverty line and a barrier to people finding work, because you don't have that money to invest in yourself, to get some training, to buy the new clothes for the job interview, to even get a haircut. Their first plan was to kick people off Newstart, make them wait 6 weeks before they can receive this measly payment to try and support themselves. Luckily, the Senate took a stand for young people and refused to pass this ridiculous measure. Yet the Liberals are refusing to listen, saying they only want to make young people wait 4 weeks now before they can get Newstart. Well, 4 weeks. The landlord doesn't care that you don't have money coming from the government to pay the rent. The Public transport doesn't care that you don't have money because it's the government's fault. But the government's approach is still to say, well, we'll deal with the national youth unemployment crisis by making life tougher for young people. And at the same time, the government wants to make learning more expensive, make it less accessible and more exclusive by cutting support for students and deregulating our universities, a move that experts have warned could see the creation of US-style $100,000 degrees. So it's harder to earn by getting a job because under this government and since the GFC the jobs aren't there in the same way. It's more expensive to try and learn. And even if you're lucky enough to get a job and to keep it and to earn an income, owning your home is becoming a pipe dream. In 1990, house prices were approximately 6 times a young person's income. In 2013, that had doubled to approximately 12 times a young person's income. It is not the fault of smashed avocados that housing is becoming increasingly unaffordable for people, because even if you find a job, even if you find a secure job, which is pretty tough to do these days, the ratio of your income to house prices is just skyrocketing, and that has happened under the watch of Liberal and Labor. The old party's policies of allowing negative gearing to happen and the capital gains tax discount to continue turned housing into an unproductive investment class, and it caused an explosion in house prices, meaning that overwhelmingly the only people who could afford to buy a house are those who've already got one. The government should be making it easier for people to buy their first home, not helping people who've already got one to buy their second, third or fourth. And the Grattan Institute found that under these and under other government policies, real wealth held by older households from 2003 through to 2012 grew by $215,000. But for younger households, it went backwards. And in 1994, young households had nearly 10% of the country's wealth. But by 2014, that had effectively halved to 5.5%. So over 20 years, young people went from having 10% of the country's wealth to having about 5%. And at the same time, for older generations, it dramatically increased. This is why young people are getting screwed. Successive governments have worked against them, dealing them in increasingly bad hand and growing intergenerational inequality. Governments have allowed the economy to run rampant and to screw young people. But the good news is that as a society we're becoming more and more aware of just how much young people are getting screwed. Academics, think tanks and civil society or organisations are all pointing out how the odds are no longer in young people's favour and how under Liberal and Labor we may be creating a situation where we are leaving the economy and household budgets and the planet worse off for generations that come after us rather than better. But the bad news is that the government's refusing to look at the bigger picture and is refusing to listen. They're being the unreasonable parent instead of listening to their children or experts, having blind faith that they know what's best, that it's to make people work for either nothing or next to nothing. If it were a lesson on safe sex, this is the government that would be pushing abstinence, not condoms. If it were a lesson on good behaviour, this is the government that's sending young people to their rooms rather than talking the issue through. Instead of working systematically to even the odds and deliver a better deal for young people, on budget night this year, the Liberals unveiled their master plan for getting young people a job, this Prepare, Trial, Hire scheme. What it really meant, though, was that earn or learn became burn and churn. Essentially, this government's plan to tackle high youth unemployment and help young people get a job is to lure them to work for below the minimum wage. The Liberals' plan won't provide secure and meaningful work for the hundreds of thousands of young people who are unemployed. What it will do is drive down wages for other workers and see employers burn and churn through young people. In fact, it could see people currently working in these roles kicked out in favour of free money and labour, courtesy of the government. Because under this program that's being enabled by this bill, by not having to hire someone at the usual wage, employers could bank more per week than the young people who are supposedly going to get a job under this scheme. In other words, this scheme will allow employers, the public purse, to take home more money than the young people who are going to be forced to work under it. Now, the Greens do not accept that to get young people into work they need to be paid as little as $4 an hour, which is well below the minimum wage, because that is what this scheme is about. Following the government's unveiling of this flagship program, the Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions said, and quote, "This internship program is a path to nowhere and gives business access to free exportable workers." And he asked, why would a business employ a minimum wage or lower paid worker when the government is ready to supply them with free labour and a $1,000 handout? And he pointed out that these internships could include low-skilled work such as work in supermarkets, which is not a plan to create real lasting jobs. It's simply substituting existing low-paid labour for even cheaper government-subsidised labour, rather than creating new jobs. Now, internships, let's be clear about this, internships, if they're structured correctly, can be a good thing. They can provide opportunities for young people to learn and build their skills. And we've had internships for a very long time. We even have every political party in this place, I'm sure, offering internships. Community groups offer internships. Organisations, like community groups and political parties, thrive on getting young people involved. But when we do it, and I'll speak here on behalf of the Greens, we don't offer out hope to people that this is some pathway to secure employment. It's about you and increasing your skills, but you're not here doing government-subsidised work where you're required to turn up at a particular time and clock off at a particular time. It's not a false job, because that is not what an internship is or should be. But when you ask people, as the government is doing under this program, to clock in and clock off, get the equivalent of $4 an hour, and then pay employers $1,000 from the public purse to put them on and displace other workers, and then at the same time hold out hope of a secure job, that is not a scheme. That is not a scheme to create lasting employment, because the simple plan is this. This is a flawed plan, dreamt up in isolation by a government that thinks they know best, but it will not help people find secure long-term work. In fact, it could just see handouts to business to force young people to work for below the minimum wage and potentially force out people from a job who are currently working in these roles, because there's nothing in this bill that provides protection for someone currently working in a low-paid job from being forced out of that job by this new scheme so that government-subsidised cheap labour can come in instead. Now, we have to take action to help make life easier for young people. That means tackling rising job insecurity, it means tackling housing unaffordability. But it's not this program. It's not this program. If we're serious, we would be investing in education. We would be investing in big job-creating projects that will provide secure work for young people, like public transport and clean energy. We would be making it easier for people to get into education and complete it. And we would end the unfair tax breaks that are pushing up the cost of housing and pricing young people out of the market. And we have to do it now. We have to do it now, because otherwise we run the risk of locking out an entire generation out of secure work, locking an entire generation out of owning their own home.